This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. Welcome to this encore edition of St. Louis on the Air. Today, we're going to go deep into one of this city's many nicknames. It's not STL or the Lou. It isn't Gateway to the West either, though that will be something we discuss. The moniker we're talking about this hour is Mound City, and we'll be exploring how that name came to be, what it's meant at different points in history, and why the backstory of this region's mounds is vital in the present, especially to the living cultural identity of St. Louis and St. Louisans and Americans across the country with Indigenous roots. Joining us today to talk about a new book that details that history is Patricia Cleary, professor of history at California State University, Long Beach, and author of Mound City, the place of the Indigenous past and present in St. Louis. Patty, welcome to St. Louis on the Air.
Thanks very much, Elaine.
So, Patty, you were born and raised in St. Louis. What is it that you knew then as a child about the mounds?
Well, about mounds in St. Louis or in Missouri overall, absolutely nothing. And I confess that ignorance freely as a starting point for both my own youth and for the inspiration for this book. Mm-hmm. I knew about Cahokia Mounds and had been there and climbed Monk's Mound like many other people.
Right. Well, and on that note, we got a couple of notes from a question that we put out asking people how they first learned about the mounds in St. Louis. And we received a note from Christy Newman, who said that her 8th grade teacher took her class on a field trip to Cahokia Mounds as part of a Missouri history requirement in 1964. And Christy also included that the teacher took them to St. Genevieve and Kaskaskia with a thank you to Jean Hutcherson, quote, best teacher ever. We also heard from Tommy, who advised that we should not miss Mound 72, which is a small ridgetop mound south of Monk's Mound at Cahokia Mounds. And that is a location that became known as Woodhenge, and that also happens to be the place where Daniel let us know that he went on an amazing winter solstice celebration event. We also want to invite you to the conversation. When did you first learn about the mounds in St. Louis? If you've been to Cahokia Mounds in Illinois, what do you remember about your first trip there? Give us a call at 314-382-8255. That's 314-382-TALK. You can also send an email to talk@stlpr.org. So, Patty, you said that in all the time that you were living here, you did not know about the mounds. Why do you think that was the case?
Well, I think there are a couple of reasons. One, because the mounds, other than Sugarloaf Mound, which stands today still near Soulard off of Highway 55 off the Broadway exit, other than Sugarloaf Mound, the mounds that stood in St. Louis City proper, just north of the Arch, were raised, and the largest and biggest big mound was leveled in 1869, and that was the last of the big ones. So there is a sort of gap of a physical presence, and the existence of a state park and the preservation of many of the mounds, though certainly far from all of them around Cahokia, ensured that that site has a more prominent place in imagination. But that's not the whole story.
Right. So these mounds then, I mean, it's called Mound City. Mound could be singular, but we're talking about multiple. And this number of them, I mean, how many mounds are we talking about? And what is it that stands in their place today, Patty?
Well, in St. Louis, just north of the Arch, from about 0.8 mile to about 1.1 mile, there was a complex of 27 monumental earthworks arranged around a plaza formation, clearly a carefully constructed and engineered site, and really massive mounds. And the largest of them, Big Mound, which stood very close to where the Stan Musial Veterans Bridge is now, was close to the size at its base of a football field, if everybody can picture that.
Wow.
And 34 feet high. So they were very large. But that's not all of the mounds there were. There were many others in what is still St. Louis City proper today, including ones near the Art Museum in Forest Park that were raised for the construction of the Art Museum and the World's Fair, as well as, according to a state manual published in the 1930s, at that point there were 28,000 identified mounds in the state of Missouri.
Wow, 28,000.
Yes.
Now, you're giving us all this information, and by training, you are an historian, and that's how you've approached this book. But the book also, it begins with your personal account of visiting the site where Big Mound once stood. Can you tell us what it was about that visit that was so notable for you and made it something that you wanted to start the book with?
Sure. First, a shout out to all of my family who still live in St. Louis and my special research assistants and brothers, Kevin and Mike. And it was with my brother, Kevin, that I was in the car driving through downtown St. Louis that day looking for the site of the Big Mound marker. This was back in 2010. And I had been thinking about the mounds a lot after working on my book on colonial St. Louis and also attending a conference on antiquities and their place in historical imagination at the Huntington Library here in Los Angeles. And Kevin and I were driving along, and it was a completely deserted downtown North Broadway Saturday morning with abandoned, boarded up warehouses, not a single person on the street, and actually a fairly grim looking bit of urban landscape. And when we came to the site of the mound marker, which was placed there in 1929 by a heritage organization, the Colonial Dames, with its own kind of inaccurate inscription, it was defaced and vandalized and in a weed-ridden circle of cobblestones in the middle of the intersection. And it was just kind of depressing and also made me ask again why I hadn't known about the mounds and why their history had been so obscured and neglected and, in fact, erased.
So what is it then? Because you mentioned antiquities, and coincidentally, we talked in the last couple weeks about Egyptology.
Yes.
What is it about that part, memory, historical architecture in America, that really stood out to you as something that warranted, if not really needed, some treatment and exploration as it relates to St. Louis?
Well, I would first acknowledge that there are some really wonderful Indigenous scholars like Gene O'Brien and Philip Deloria and others who have been working on this topic in other ways. And one of the things that Gene O'Brien writes about is the process of firsting and lasting, how settlers and colonists often acknowledged Indigenous histories as the first in a particular region, but then claimed those histories as their own, appropriated them, and made themselves the sort of logical inheritors of Indigenous traditions. And in the case of the United States, when it was founded, there was this real search for ancient history. And if you think about Washington, D.C., and the architectural symbolism of that city, it's all classical Greece and Rome, right? It's a city full of temples with columns, and it harkens back to an ancient history that's European, but not English. People are trying to get away from England. And in the case of much of the rest of the U.S., the search for ancient histories led white Americans in the late 18th and early 19th century to look at what was around them. And that was huge Indigenous mounds and settlements all over the place.
And speaking of those who are looking, searching, naming things, placing people and what they were doing, what they were living, how they were living in the ancient past, there were visitors from Europe that you wrote about who came to St. Louis and recognized that it was not so ancient after all, right?
Well, people like Charles Dickens, lots of German, European princes, dukes came in search of St. Louis's indigenous past. And they commented on how the recent past of French settlement and then later American and German settlement was fairly new and ramshackle in some cases, but that there was a much older history that was represented by the mounds, which for the first few decades that St. Louis existed, they were beyond the city boundaries on the northern edge. So people would take excursions out to the mounds and have picnics on top of Big Mound. And eventually, in fact, there was a restaurant, Mound Pavilion, built on top of this largest mound in the 1840s.
And so this turning these mounds into places for commercial purposes, that is something that continued, didn't it?
Yes. In fact, one of the first that was used for infrastructure purposes was a mound that was excavated and turned into a reservoir so that you needed to be able to pump water throughout the city, have it at a high enough elevation. And that was one that was part of the Plaza complex. And other early settlers built their homes on top of the mounds. They were fine real estate prospects. So they were pretty quickly used for a variety of purposes, including just simply being excavated for the dirt within them to be turned into rail bed landfill.
Right. So then this moniker then of Mound City, it was in the interest of white settlers and those who were building what we know as St. Louis to hold on to that. And in the research that you did, was there anything that stood out about why they were claiming Mound City even as they were destroying those very mounds?
Yeah, it's very complicated, and I will try to be brief and refer everybody who wants to get all the nuances to the book. But part of it was that during this period, so we're talking mainly about the early to late 1800s, as St. Louis is expanding with massive immigration and the city is spreading north and west and eventually south, there's a takeover of land, and there are developments almost always in the hands of private individuals, and there is a removal at the same time of indigenous populations through coerced treaties. So territory that was once Osage and Missouri and Illini Confederacy and others ended up having indigenous populations forcibly removed, often through trickery on the part of treaty negotiators, and sometimes at the point of a gun. So there's this problem. How do you celebrate an ancient indigenous past, and why do you do it at the same time that you are committing genocidal campaigns of removal against a contemporary indigenous population? So that's the conundrum, right? How do those two things, how does that paradox work? And part of it is that what St. Louisans and many others who talked about the mounds and peoples whom they referred to collectively as mound builders, that's a white term for indigenous societies that were throughout the eastern half of the United States, of what's today the United States. How could they connect themselves to mound builders? And there was a really horrible argument that said the mound builders were an ancient civilized people who were destroyed by the ancestors of contemporary indigenous peoples.
Oh, wow.
So that contemporary indigenous peoples in this framing had the blame for destroying a civilized society, and that by removing these less civilized contemporary indigenous peoples, then white Americans would be able to resume the mantle of civilization established in these areas by mound builders.
It's breathtaking.
It is. And in fact, it's entirely self-serving. And an important part of that self-serving rationalization was an absolute willingness to overlook, not report, flat out contradict indigenous knowledge sources about the mounds. So there were contemporary indigenous peoples in the early 1800s, late 1700s around St. Louis who were reporting to white settlers, including George Rogers Clark, William Clark's brother, about how their ancestors had built the mounds at Cahokia and elsewhere. And while Clark and some others said, yes, of course, these mounds are indigenous, there's no reason to doubt their histories. The people who are here today had ancestors who built these mounds. Many white Americans discounted that knowledge.
Right.
And
we're going to explore that a little bit further. We're going to take a very quick break here. We'll come back and continue this conversation very shortly. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.
Welcome back. Let's return to our conversation with historian, professor, and author Patricia Cleary. We're talking about her new book, Mound City, The Place of the Indigenous Past and Present in St. Louis. Now, Patty, before the break, we were talking about paradox and the two contradicting projects that white settlers, in particular white Americans, were engaged in. And it has much to do with what you have termed the myth of the vanishing Indian. Can you talk with us a little bit about what that was and an example of how that was being done in St. Louis, maybe in an area that many people would be familiar with?
Ooh, that's a good question. I'm not sure about the latter part of it, but I would start by saying that the vanishing Indian myth, it's not my term. It's one that was widely in play in the 19th century. And the idea of the vanishing Indian at its root claimed that indigenous peoples in the territory that is today the United States were destined to vanish. And they would vanish through one of two ways. They would vanish by being fully assimilated and subsumed into American culture and no longer maintain languages or tribal affiliation or lands or religious practices. And the other was that they would vanish by dying out. And the latter was especially potent. And this idea fueled paternalistic attitudes on the part of the U.S. government. That's how they couched removal practices, that to protect indigenous peoples from the corrupting influences of white society, they needed to be removed to a distance where they could become settled farmers practicing agriculture and other institutional and religious practices identical to those of white society. And there were lots of sedentary farming indigenous peoples. This was another myth or generalization that was untrue. But this idea of the vanishing Indian contributed in no large part to, I think, what still many contemporary non-Native Americans think today of indigenous peoples as being largely past tense, that people grew up watching television shows about cowboys and Indians or seeing Westerns that presented the inevitable progress of white civilization over savage populations. All of this mythic and altogether self-serving.
Now, there's a name that comes up as we're talking about policy and also, I think, around shaping popular imagination about Native Americans, and that is William Clark.
Yes.
Patty, talk with us about William Clark and how, especially that paternalistic attitude and the actions that came with that, how that played into people sort of buying into this idea of the vanishing Indian.
Yes, so Clark is a really fascinating and complicated and problematic figure. I mean, most people think of Clark in conjunction with Meriwether Lewis and the Lewis and Clark expedition and the opening of the West. And of course, their journey to the West in the early 1800s was dependent on the assistance, the really crucial assistance of Sacagawea, an indigenous woman who accompanied them, who was the wife of a French trader. And on that voyage, Clark and Lewis were very dependent on Sacagawea's alliances, linguistic skills, contacts, familiarity with plants that were edible. And Clark took particular shine to her son, whom he later wanted to have in St. Louis to be educated. And his nickname was Pompey. And Clark saw his role as, in a sense, protector of indigenous peoples. And in that role, and he had lots of official government roles as superintendent of Indian Affairs, and he had a large council chamber, a huge museum, in fact, that became known as Clark's Indian Museum, that existed from the late 18-teens until his death in 1838. And indigenous delegations there on trading or diplomatic missions would come and meet in that chamber. And Clark hosted lots of tourists and dignitaries to observe these gatherings. And the walls of this museum were covered with basically the spoils of the Lewis and Clark expedition, as well as gifts from native peoples as well. And artists like George Catlin came to that museum to study the artifacts, the regalia, and used them to paint and depict indigenous peoples and their culture as one that was waning and disappearing. But in the terms of the vanishing Indian and his paternalism, Clark was one of the most important figures in negotiating and securing treaties with indigenous peoples. He was responsible for more treaties than any other individual that led to the removal of native peoples from their lands during the era of treaty making between the United States government and indigenous tribes.
Mm-hmm. And from what I understand, there is much of that is covered now in the museum that is part of the Gateway Arch.
Mm-hmm.
As we're talking about past history, and specifically about the nickname of Mound City, Gateway to the West is also another nickname that is used to describe St. Louis. And there is no casual coincidence that they're self-given nicknames. What is the connection between those two monikers, Patty, and how it sort of helps us understand the way that St. Louis has developed?
Right. So Gateway to the West celebrates Lewis and Clark and the Lewis and Clark expedition and the Jefferson Expansion Memorial, the Arch, and the Louisiana Purchase, which basically doubled the size of the United States. And in the period that really is the focus here in the early 1800s, St. Louis was the point from which trading expeditions would go up the Missouri River, from which tourists would get supplies and head west and north to see indigenous peoples in their homelands. This was after they were removed from the state of Missouri, largely. Mm-hmm. And this idea of it being the gateway to the West, the gateway and the jumping off point to new and unsettled lands, was something that was hugely appealing to European immigrants and to white Americans who saw the potential for acquiring land themselves and going west. From an indigenous perspective, you might think about looking east rather than west.
Right.
And about the invasion of wave after wave of immigrants who are moving into native lands, because, of course, not only Missouri, but all of the United States was settled and populated by millennia-old indigenous societies. And Mound City, it's a funny one because the term starts to come up. I haven't been able to pinpoint the exact time someone said it or wrote it or used it first. But as the city expanded northward and began to encroach upon the mounds, and the first structures were built on them in the late 1810s and early 1820s, and as Broadway expanded northward, real estate developers began to talk about building lots available in the area of the mounds, and all sorts of businesses began to have the nickname Mound City. So you had Mound City Cured Hams, you had Mound City Engine Company, and Mound City initially arose in conjunction with that neighborhood specifically. But then it became part of the external reputation of St. Louis, and people talked about St. Louis as the Mound City. Mm-hmm. And on the cover of the book, there is at the top an image of Big Mound, and at the bottom there is a lithograph that's dated from roughly 1873, 4 years after the destruction, the final leveling of the Big Mound. And it has above it, it says Mound City in huge letters at a time when St. Louisans had just finished leveling the last of these great mounds. Mm-hmm. So it's incredibly paradoxical and ironic that they're claiming an indigenous history and as Mound City and claiming access to an interior of economic opportunity for whites and access to indigenous peoples, first as partners in the fur trade and then as obstacles to settlement, mm-hmm. that both of those names are important.
So, Patricia, with this book, I mean, clearly, and you've stated that this is just a beginning. There's so much more to be written, multiple bookshelves full. Is there perhaps one takeaway that you would offer, that you want to make sure that people really understand from this book that you have written?
For me, as a historian and as a professor of U.S. history, I am very conscious that the way we think about and teach history and the stories that get told and excluded could not matter more. And I'm conscious of the fact that many people worry that historians are trying to teach people to hate the United States or hate America. I don't think there is anything wrong or problematic or at all paradoxical about trying to understand and be critical of one's own history in order to fulfill the promise of our country's founding documents. Mm-hmm. The idea that all people are created equal, that we want an inclusive past and an inclusive present and future, and it's incumbent on all of us to recognize how our history has been shaped.
Mm-hmm. We need to take a very quick break here, but we will come back to continue this conversation. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.
Welcome back. Let's return to our conversation with Patricia Cleary, history professor at California State University, Long Beach, and author of the new book, Mound City, The Place of the Indigenous Past and Present in St. Louis. And to that point about the present, not only in your book, Patty, but in living context and living people, our producer, Emily Woodbury, spoke with Anita Fields. Anita is a citizen of the Osage Nation, a multidisciplinary artist, and a National Endowment for the Arts Heritage awardee. She's from Oklahoma, but she's visited Sugarloaf Mound in St. Louis several times. She told us that each time she visits, she feels an emotional connection to the site.
I have a very strong feeling about land and how land holds the memory of the cultures and the peoples who lived there. And because I use clay, and I've been using it for, almost 50 years, I have a relationship with my materiality. And clay is basically the earth. And so I have very strong feelings about how the earth holds the memory of the people who were once occupying a space. And then also knowing that we are associated, with these spaces, the values that were formed that still influence us today as Osage people, our worldview. I know that was being formed and shaped, during these time periods that our people were there. And to know that this continuum is still in existence brings me great happiness and peace, actually.
Anita Fields has also visited the site where Big Mound once stood, where a marker now sits amid an industrial site. She said she finds it upsetting to visit the site and to see the photographs depicting its destruction.
And so there's, the people who are doing the work are standing on top of it, and and it was an attraction, and but then it was just leveled and gone. So I can't help but feel a connection even to that site, and I don't know how people could not value an earthwork as majestic and wonderful as something like Big Mound or any of the mounds that were destroyed in that area, because I know that it had to, you had to have fantastic skills to be able to do that in terms of engineering, in terms of a workforce, in terms of its alignment, these alignments to the cosmos, and the kind of knowledge and information that you would have to have in order to do that is really spectacular. And so for them not to value it at that level, I have a hard time understanding that.
Anita hopes that the Native presence at these sites remains and that people understand that the descendants of the people who built the mounds are people of the present. She also hopes that people will engage more with the history of the land and the people who used to call it home.
Know a little bit about our history, know about how we left Missouri, and maybe do further research on the treaties and the things that happened in our history to make our way into what is present-day Oklahoma, because that's a whole story in itself. So I would hope that people would want to pursue those kinds of educational opportunities.
Another Native person in the present, and very much present here with us today, is Galen Gritz. He's a member of the Cherokee Nation and founding member of Alliance for Native Programs and Initiatives, a group that helps St. Louis institutions coordinate projects and events that center Indigenous people, culture, and history. Galen, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
OCO, Wado. Hello, thanks.
So earlier in the show, Patty had shared with us how she first learned about Cahokia Mounds and the mounds in St. Louis, and she was born and raised here in St. Louis, something that you have in common with her. Was your own first introduction to the mounds anything like hers or some of the people who share their stories?
I graduated high school in 1970, and about 1976, 77 was the first time I went to the mounds.
Okay. And with whom and what were the circumstances?
It was a colleague of mine. I was working for the state at the time, and she had actually done a part of a study over there, a dig, basically, as a student. And so took me over there, and more or less I've been going ever since. I usually go about 4 or 5 times a year.
Mm-hmm.
And then I became aware that there were other mounds in sites. There's a lot more sites than where the mounds were, but there were a lot of mounds.
Yeah.
St. Louis County, St. Louis City, etc. Supposedly the art museum is built on a mound.
Right, right. Were there certain, social or cultural factors at play that you think contributed to the reason it took you as long as it did to visit the mounds and to learn about them?
Well, I do a lot of public speaking on this. I spoke about 20 times last year. And what I say is that anybody that watches BBC mystery murders knows that you hide the body, you wipe for evidence, fingerprints, and you have a story other than the one of the crime that was committed. And so the goal of this country from 1776 to 1912, when Arizona became the last 48th state down here, was to take the land from the Indians. And it was a crime, and it cost a lot, and so you hide it. And that's why people are always amazed to find out anything about Native American history, because it's completely different than the story that was spun.
So I was born in Canada. I grew up there. There was very much about First Nations people that I did not learn from the time I was in kindergarten through the time I left, which was grade 8. And so I cannot speak to what it's like for people who grew up here. But even among those who have lived here, their families have been here for some generations. They said that, Cahokia Mounds, for example, was their first understanding of Indigenous people in the St. Louis region. One of the ones that does exist still, the mounds, is Sugarloaf Mound. Can you describe for us, Galen, what is the state of that mound now, and also of mound markers in the city today?
Well, I've been up recently to the big mound marker up in North Broadway a couple of times, and it's desolate. There's no neighborhood around it. It's in the middle of an old industrial site that's falling down. There's highways going by. It's a little tricky to find. And it's almost like going out to Arizona or New Mexico. It's so hot. The sun's just bearing down. And Sugarloaf itself, no offense to my friends, the Wasatch or Osage. And I had dinner at an Anita Fields family summer home a year ago, May. I was down in Hominy, Oklahoma, and they very graciously fed a bunch of us dinner down there. So I know Anita, not well, but I do know her. But Sugarloaf is not much of a mound. It's half a mound.
Right.
And it's hard to find. If you know where it is, you can see it from the highway as you go flying by on 55. But there's a house built on it. It's a half a mound. It was leveled at one time. The top was taken off, and there's another building next to it. So it's not what you would think normally. But there are supposed to be mounds left in the city of St. Louis. I don't know about them so much. People don't want to talk about them because they don't want there to be looting. I know for a fact there are some in St. Louis County.
Sure.
And some on private property. But again, we don't talk about that much because we don't want people necessarily to go out and start digging and doing that kind of thing.
Because that has happened. It has been happening.
Sure.
So when you take people to these markers, for example, and then you tell them about the history of the mounds, what kinds of reactions do you get from folks?
People are surprised that there was so much built environment here, because you can say it was that for sure, that it had that much effect. They found copper from Michigan. They found seashells from the Gulf of Mexico. It goes from the Appalachians all the way out to the Rockies because they have obsidian, and there's a place in Montana that you can get obsidian. It's not from here. So there's all kinds of evidence that it was just like St. Louis, the middle of the country. And, of course, you go by canoe from here, and you can get a lot of places.
Right.
Which is how Marquette and Joliet showed up here. They showed up in a Native American canoe. In my opinion, it's a perfect technological invention.
Right.
It's never been improved upon since it was first made 5,000 years ago.
True. Well, and speaking of technology and of the things that have been looted over time, we had a response from Emma, who talked about going to Cahokia Mounds in particular, when she was a child. And she says, I don't remember hardly anything except a vague sense of reverence, a museum, and my mom telling me they would go sledding there as kids because it wasn't known, to them or protected at that time. And the way that field trips sort of indicate what is both important historically, but can also be forgotten in a way too. I mean, Patty, the way that mounds are portrayed on field trips, and then the things that you see in the gift shop that people can buy, there are flutes to play, there are arrowheads in the gift store. What does that indicate about where we are now insofar as our recognition of what is really important about the present?
Galen, do you want to respond first, or shall I? I'm not sure, Elaine.
Go ahead. You can take it.
Well, sure. Thank you. Well, it's wonderful that people can go to museums, and there are museums associated with many mound sites throughout the eastern half of the U.S., particularly in the southeast, and flutes and other objects are fine, but I think that we're not being reminded adequately of some of the ongoing, very, very painful issues that when these mounds were excavated and the ones in St. Louis razed, they were full of human remains and sacred funerary objects, and hundreds of thousands of human remains of Indigenous peoples continue to sit in museums and private collections and universities and other institutions across the country to this day. And there is a very important and very slow ongoing effort for those remains to be repatriated. But there are a lot of ancestors, people who were in those mounds, who are sitting in museums today. Mm-hmm. And that's a contemporary issue that doesn't necessarily get addressed by thinking about some of the gift store objects one can purchase.
Mm-hmm. Galen, is there something you'd like to add?
Well, I find it to be very bizarre and brutal that you would need to dig up people's bones. I mean, I can study George Washington or William Clark. I don't need to go see their bones somewhere or their contemporaries.
Right.
And I don't know what the fascination was. I think it has something to do with our very basic thing in our DNA. We conquered these people. We took them. We killed them. So here's the proof. And if you think about it, all of our attack helicopters today are named after Native American groups.
They are indeed.
The Apache, the Black Hawk. So it makes us seem bigger. Even though at the time of Wounded Knee in 1890, that was a census year, there's 63 million Americans and only 248,000 Native Americans left. And that's 63 million compared to 250,000. So much for the so-called Indian Wars.
Right.
Right. And if I could add, Elaine, to that, there was a real fascination with categorizing and measuring crania in the 19th century.
Right.
And the federal government ordered Army officers and surgeons to collect Indigenous people's skulls in the late 1800s. And the skulls that they exhumed from burial sites were in some cases ancient, but in some cases only a few weeks old. And these were measured by a pseudoscientist, Samuel Morton, who published this huge collection, Crania Americana, that measured the capacities of the crania of different races for the purposes of promoting scientific racist hierarchies of the kind that Galen was just referring to.
And I think this brings us, it's terrible to think about this being visited upon anyone. But the fact that we're sitting here together and we're talking about this book, and present is so much a part of what we're discussing, because Native Americans, Indigenous people are still here. You're sitting in front of me, Galen. Insofar as how children, for example, that seems like a good time to start teaching them the truth about certain things. what is it that can be shared with kids such that there will not be a perpetuation of that notion of vanishing or vanished Indian, and that there can be better teaching, better understanding, not just better conversations, but better action when it comes to preservation of what needs to be protected, but also of honoring those who are still here very much alive with us, Galen?
Well, I think the state of Illinois passed a law recently that you have to teach Native American history from K to 12. We need to do that in Missouri. It's going to be a long time before that gets done. But I don't think that we're a multicultural sideshow to the United States. I think we're foundational to who we are. And anything that we can teach about Native Americans in the past, in the present, and in the meantime is very effective. I mean, we didn't get the right to vote till 1924. We didn't get the right to our religion till 1978. We still serve at a higher rate than any other ethnic group and have since the Revolutionary War, the U.S. military.
Right.
These are facts that people don't know. Most of us do not live on reservations, and so therefore we're taken as not being as authentic because of that. And yet I know plenty of white folks that don't live in Massachusetts that no longer dress as pilgrims.
Sure.
But I somehow accept them as being white. So, there's that.
Yeah.
So we just need to teach is
And
what we need to do.
in your capacity as the founding member of the Alliance for Native Programs and Initiatives, again, this is about helping St. Louis institutions coordinate projects and events. What has happened? What kinds of programs or events have taken place here that you think are moving us in the right direction?
Well, I graduated from the University of Missouri St. Louis with a history degree in 1975, and there was nothing for my interest at that time that was developing for Native American. I would have to go maybe to the University of Oklahoma, maybe one other place. There were very few places offering that kind of curriculum at that point for the master's level. But what I've seen in the last couple of years have been very, very exciting. In fact, there's so much going on, it's hard to keep up with. And that is from here, the Pulitzer, Mobot, the zoo, Warshoe at their Booter Center for American Indian Studies. I'm going to leave out people. Universities like St. Louis U had their first course on Native Americans this past spring.
Its first course.
Yes.
Sure. Okay.
And Warshoe did one on the mounds a year ago. SIUE. It's amazing. UMSL. There's a lot of ethnobotanists. There's a lot of geographers. There's a lot of historians, anthropologists that are doing things, and it's a little hard to keep up with. But there's a lot more now than I've ever seen.
Right.
It's exciting.
And in the last minute and a half or so, what would you recommend for an individual who wants to educate themselves better? What is a resource that they should be taking advantage of?
Books. I know not everybody reads, but there's a lot of Native American fiction and historical things out there now compared to used to be. I would say movies. I'm not real thrilled with Killers of the Flower Moon. It's an important story. I don't think that was one of Martin's best movies.
Okay.
But there's some TV shows.
Right.
And people like doing that. So on Hulu, you can watch Reservation Dogs, which I think is well worth watching. And then there's another one that's an offshoot of that about a small town in New England, Rumford Falls, I think. And if you can't find that streaming, you can find both of these or DVDs at your local libraries.
Well, it's encouraging to hear that there is more available now.
Yes.
Galen Gritz is a member of the Cherokee Nation and founding member of the group Alliance for Native Programs and Initiatives. Patricia Cleary is California State University history professor and author of Mound City, the place of the Indigenous past and present in St. Louis. Patricia and Galen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elaine.
After our broadcast, Galen Gritz shared an original poem with us, and we're pleased to bring that to you in this podcast extra. Here's Galen.
From the St. Louis Anthology, 2019, edited by Ryan Suchler. Galen Gritz, Blue Thunder, Red Thunder. Gateway Arts reflects St. Louis's role in the westward expansion. News headline. Smiling with the smoke clinging to the mountains over our heads and the grass singing with growth under our feet, we smiled at your coming and wondered at your companionship and became Baptists and Methodists, joining hope to hope. We were too small for the four corners to fight us. We were too small like the squirrel and the otter. We were too small, we thought, like you. But you came from beyond the air and earth and pitted despair to death and forsook the ways of your fathers, exposing the underside of the rock, exposing the shadow of the sun. But somehow you buried the sun with that shadow, as no man would have thought possible. Blue thunder, red thunder. But we were too small, and our name was not great. Nor is it now spoken. We have passed to gray, following the lost sun, while you thrash wildly in your darkness. Yourself blue and red, power and death. There is gnashing of teeth, but no wailing. There's no one who knows us now, no one to miss our poverty and hardship that you induced. We are made instead into storybook heroes and noble antagonists, the most villainous of circumstances. You thought we had passed to gray, following the lost sun. You did not get us all.
Galen, what was it that inspired that poem?
The lack of visibility that we have.
Mm-hmm.
You have to remember that in 1491, half the world was Native American, from the Arctic Circle to the very southern tip of South America. The last census in 2020 in the state of Missouri were 0.5%. So we lost 99.5% of the people of that lived here at one point.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why Native people like to say, party like it's 1491.
Oh. I've not heard that, but I don't think it's going to be something I'll forget very soon. Was there someone that you had in mind as you were writing that?
No, I think just the isolation myself, having received a bachelor's of history from the University of Missouri and not being able to progress the way that I wanted to. I mean, I've always lived here. I have family here and friends, and plenty of my friends have moved away, but I always felt close to my family and needed to be here. And so I stayed. But like I said, it was a pretty sterile area for a Native person to be with, not community at all.
Mm-hmm.
So,
with the publication of this book, and Patricia Cleary is very clear that she is not of Indigenous descent. Does this give you maybe some hope that there will be greater recognition of the continued existence of Native Americans in St. Louis, and also at the same time, their history here and how important it is to understand that?
She writes with a very clear, accessible voice. It's like having a conversation. I haven't finished her book, but what I've read so far, and as I mentioned, there's so few of us, we need allies. And I see this as a great voice lending itself, hopefully, to a chorus, hopefully to something like the fourth movement of Beethoven's Ninth, Ode to Joy, that more and more voices will join and more people will realize not only is it necessary that we learn, but it's a beautiful thing to be part of. Because you can see the universe as a basket. We're all related.
Today's episode was produced by Emily Woodbury
and Elaine Cha, with audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis